What's going on, everyone? I'm Sage, and in this video I wanted to finally go over the changes and adjustments that have come to the Furl spec. This will be covering all of the changes that have occurred to Furl and the Covenants after the deep dive video series that I started a little bit over a month ago. The beta is ongoing, and changes and adjustments to soulbinds and covenants as well as some tuning happens every single week. So the information in those previous videos are not completely accurate at this time. So let's start by looking at all the massive amount of changes that have come to the Furl Druids over the many builds. Alright, so if we're being honest, there are not a massive amount of changes that have happened to the baseline Furl abilities since I put out the deep dive videos. And it has been long awaited to see something pop under that Furl header during the beta builds. However, I do have a theory as to why Furl has not received as much attention to its base ability, so stay tuned to the end to hear my opinion on that. So even though there was not many changes to Furl's baseline abilities, there have been several changes to other systems that do and will affect Furl Druid's damage profile in the Shadowlands. So to start this off, let's talk about some of the changes that have come to the Shadowlands that will affect every player. One of these changes was that the secondary stat diminishing returns was increased from starting at 25% to starting at 30%. And the max amount of secondary stat percent was increased from 106% to 126%. This means that the secondary stats will have more value at the start when players start gearing up, but will lose a portion of their value over time as they continue to stack up the same stat. If we apply this to Furl Druids, specifically, this will probably affect our mastery the most. The reason why is because as a Furl Druid, we get a large amount of mastery per point of mastery we obtain. So this secondary stat will very quickly start getting a diminishing return on its value. Once this happens, we will start to lean towards versatility as a higher value stat, because even though we get significantly less versatility percentage per point of verse, we will get the full value of that secondary stat while it remains under the 30% marker. Crit will always be a stat that we will stack up as well, but I don't see this one reaching the percentage amount that our mastery does, at least not at the beginning of the expansion. All in all, this change will see characters being slightly stronger at the start, which is fine in my opinion, and the diminishing return on secondary stats will be great for item level upgrades because of the primary stat later on in the expansion. Moving on to the next large change that will affect everyone's damage profile is the soulbinds. Blizzard has done several tuning and redesigns to the soulbinds and their abilities, but the most noticeable ones for everyone will be that they flipped all the soulbinds upside down, and now the major powers gained from the trees that players had to press down to obtain is now the very first ability that will be gained by all players, giving immediate power gain for most classes. For most, I think that this change is welcome, but in my opinion, the rest of the abilities are not extremely interesting and will make it far less exciting to progress down the tree, but I do like having the power right off the start. The other major change that affects everyone is that they have taken one potency conduit from every single soulbind, reducing it to only 2 potency conduits per soulbind. This change at first felt a little bad because there were definitely some sets of 3 conduits that felt like they would be great for damage profiles, and this does limit some of the optional setups that might have been possible in the past. Several specs, including Furl, have some very strong conduits that are pretty much set in stone at the moment, and the third conduit gave a chance to have some of the optional potency conduits in play, and this is just not the case anymore. This does, however, make soulbinds less powerful overall and less power gained from conduits, which isn't a bad thing, with there already being so many systems to tune when layered on top of one another that this change will help with. Alright, now that we have gone over the overview of what has changed for everyone, let's start getting into the Furl spec itself. The first adjustment that I want to go over is that we received a 5% damage increase to our damage aura. What this is a damage modifier that hides in the background that allows Blizzard to give a flat increase over the abilities of a class. This modifier has been increased from 15 to 20, giving all of the abilities that you see on the screen a 5% buff. This is great for Furl, it just raises the damage up, but I don't think that it cloaks the issue that some of the abilities have when it comes to the damage from each ability. At this point, though, any increase is welcome. And speaking of any increase that is welcome, Just now, as I was making this video, another increase was mentioned in a blue post that is coming to Feral Druids on the regional restart this week. This is another 8% increase to all damaging abilities, which is great to see that Feral is still on the radar, and this change is happening to the pre-patch, and I assume that it will soon follow into the beta build in this coming week, because it doesn't make sense that they would adjust the damage profile for only the pre-patch event, which is only 2 weeks long, and not for the damage profile going into the future. So I do expect to see this inside the beta build in this coming week. Next up, let's talk about the legendary changes that have come to Feral, which is not a lot, but it has made some of them a little better. So first up, we have Drought of Deep Focus, which when Moonfire, Rake, Rip, or Rejuvenation are active on a single target, their effects are increased by 30%, and now it is 40%. This legendary is still in the same position it was in before the buff, and that is purely single target, and the abilities that it buffs are not the strongest abilities we have on single target currently. This might come ahead on single target only fights, but it is unlikely because the bleeds that it increases are still only doing about 10 or less % of our damage, making 40% increase to that 10% of damage not significant enough for most situations. Next up, we have Eye of Fearful Symmetry, which was changed from Tiger's Fury causes your next finishing moves to restore 3 combo points to Tiger's Fury causing your next 2 finishing moves to restore 2 combo points. This is definitely a welcome change to the legendary. When testing the original version of this Lego, I placed it in the feedback that it would be nice if more than just one finisher got the effects, and they seem to agree with the players that had the same opinion. This is going to mainly be an option in an AoE environment where mobs are dying periodically, so that you will gain more Tiger Fury procs with the Predator talent as enemies start to die. This does help with the lack of crit because it does give us combo points refunded, allowing us a faster pace to get finisher moves out at 5 combo points. There are still legendaries that might feel better at the start of the expansion, such as Cata. However, this one could see some play in Mythic Plus, especially on weeks like Bursting, where the group will want to stagger some of the deaths, and this will give more optimization to Tiger's Fury, and this legendary ties into that. The last legendary we received a change to is Frenzy Band, where the combo point generating abilities give an additional bleed on the target for what was 50% and is now 100% of their damage over 8 seconds. When I tested this, you definitely noticed a change, especially in the burst window that Feral has, and when paired up with Ravenous Frenzy or Convoke the Spirits. Ravenous Frenzy gives a damage bonus to the combo points generating abilities, making this legendary bleed stronger, and Convoke the Spirits allows you to get far more combo point generating abilities within the Berserk's time. The time reduction does play against Ravenous Frenzy still though, because after the first sync up at 3-minute cooldown each, the Berserk cooldown will be back up before the Ravenous Frenzy is. This does play into the cooldown of the Convoke though, because it will reduce Berserk's timer to be closer to the 2-minute cooldown that Convoke has. All in all, however, this is most likely not the legendary anyone will go after until we are able to have this as a second Lego, because it will only enhance our burst and not our full damage profile like many of the other legendaries do for Feral. That is all the legendary adjustments that we have seen so far, and I would like a little more to go into the effects of some of these, or they will just not be needed until we can pair up multiple legendaries. Next, let's talk about the conduits for Feral that have received changes. There are not very many, however, they are still impactful. First up, we have Conflux of the Elements, which while channeling Convoke the Spirits, your damage and healing is increased by 12% and is now 15%. Convoke is decently strong, and this just further enhances it. However, with the change to only having 2 potency conduits per soulbind, this might now not get taken because Convoke has a 2-minute cooldown, and this will only enhance the burst from this ability. Next up, we have the big change to Endless Thirst, which gives Ravenous Frenzy increase to your critical strike chance by was 2% per stack to 0.5% per stack. This change pretty much made this conduit garbage and will never be selected. Crit itself is only a chance at getting a critical hit with an ability, and until this becomes a guaranteed at 100%, it will always be a random chance at getting the damage increase that you're hoping for. And at 0.5% each ability that stacks, as the ability is in use, will not get very high and get even less utilization because of the chance. The last change is to one of the two main conduits that Feral will definitely be using, and that is Taste for Blood, which gives Ferocious Bite deals was 3% and now it's 2% increased damage for each of your bleeds on the target. This was a 9% increase to Ferocious Bite and is now a 6% increase if you have Rake, Rip, and Thrash on the target. Ferocious Bite is our highest damaging ability, and this brings it down by a small percentage. I don't honestly see the data that would suggest that this needed to be reduced, because if they are looking at how much of our damage is just from one ability, it doesn't really stop it from still being over 40% of our damage on a single target. And if you look at other classes like Frost Mage, Ice Lance is 70% of their damage right now. It was kind of a hit out of nowhere, and I don't see the reason to nerf this ability currently. Not a massive amount of changes to conduits in total, and maybe we'll see some changes to come with these effects. Now let's take a look within each covenant and see what has changed with the covenant abilities as well as the soulbind specific to that covenant. So let's start with the oldest video that I created, the Nightfae, and start updating that covenant. The Nightfae covenant gives Feral Druids Convoke the Spirits, which has been changed and did receive a blue post about its selection of abilities when it's used. The main change is that it was decreased from 16 spells in 4 seconds to 12 spells in 4 seconds. This was a decent hit to its overall damage because it was doing between 3 to 5 Ferocious Bites and now does in the range of 2 to 3 Ferocious Bites, and RNG still affects this ability, so you can get lucky and roll and get more Ferocious Bites or less depending on the fight. The blue post that we received from Blizzard states that Convoke the Spirits will now try to use more consistent number of current form abilities. There are exceptions. For example, if no hostiles are in range, Convoke will use 12 friendly spells regardless of spec. But on average, Convoke should much more consistently use 7 to 8 current form spells. Consistency will make this spell stronger because it lowers the chance that a really bad RNG roll from the abilities it casts. Like I stated in the Nightfae deep dive video, this ability does have several ways to enhance to make the 12 spells now even stronger, and it does give a strong burst as well as a way to do abilities while regenerating energy, which makes for a smooth opener because you will continue to output damage for longer before it starts to slow down. The second ability you obtain from Nightfae is Soul Shape, and this ability has not received any changes. And it still has the issue of taking Feral out of its form and placing you in caster form, making this ability only really used for the blink to get out of something, or if you just wanted to get faster getting to a location that you can't use travel form for. Now let's start looking at the soulbinds and what has changed other than the conduits being reduced and the tree being flipped upside down. I'm not going to go over every single change because there are several increases or decreases by about 1% and don't really need to be gone over. So instead I will go over what is actually impactful on all the Covenant Soulbind trees. So for the Nightfae, first up is Naya. Naya very recently got a rather large change to their main ability, Grove Invigoration, which is not the first ability you obtain from here. The new version is healing or dealing damage has a chance to grant you a stack of Redirected Anima. Redirected Anima increases your maximum health by 1% and your mastery by 25 for 30 seconds, and stacks overlap. Convoke the Spirits grants you 16 stacks of Redirected Anima. So previously, this ability gained stacks over a massive amount of time, and once you use Convoke, it would turn those stacks into Mastery. The problem was that you very rarely got to 10 stacks within the 2-minute cooldown of Convoke, making this not very powerful. However, with this current iteration, it is massively better state than what it was for the Feral Druid. As we previously discussed, Mastery is a strong secondary stat that Feral obtains a large amount of percentage per point of Mastery, and this ability not only gives you a proc of this ability while in normal combat during Convoke's cooldown, but will give a full 16 stacks, so 400 Mastery, when you use this ability and lasts for 30 seconds. This gives Feral Druid roughly 23% mastery, or at least this is what it gave me, making this a very strong ability and slightly changing when you use this ability in your opening rotation, because now you will want the mastery buff for your burst damage. So right after you set up your first abilities, you will want to use this so that your Berserk plus Ferocious Bite spam will get the damage increase. This works out very well for Feral Druids and gives Naya a massive amount of value. The problem though is that if you look at other specs in the game that have a short cooldown ability, such as Monks in the Nightfae Covenant with Feline Stomp with a 30-second cooldown, can have this ability active 100% of the time, more than likely making this ability way too strong and making me think that this current iteration is not going to stay this way, even though it is a great change for Feral Druids because of the cooldown on Convoke. For other classes, this might get adjusted. All we can do is hope that the adjustment does not hurt its power for us too much. The other ability that I want to mention, because Feral Druids will be taking this in her tree route, is Naya's Tool's Poison, which gives your Interrupt a damage ability to place a poison dot on the target, and if we interrupt a second time, it will do a flat amount of damage. This ability was reduced and then increased, and then currently it is stronger than it was when I went over it for the Nightfae deep dive video. This is an ability that incentivizes using Interrupt as much as possible in all situations because it will add more damage. If Grove Invigoration stays the same, Naya will be a very strong soulbind, and more than likely the go-to soulbind for Feral Druids in this covenant. Next up, we have Dreamweaver, which has not received a massive amount of changes, but Pod Tender, which is the cheat death ability, can now take more damage while you are healing within it before it breaks, permanently killing you instead of rezzing you. The other ability that was buffed on Dreamweaver is Field of Blossoms, which now Convoke will put flowers at your feet for 30 seconds, up from 10 seconds. That will increase your haste by 12%, up from 10%. I don't see this ability or Soulbind being very strong for Feral Druid. Haste is not our strongest stat, and it would also confine Feral to one spot to get the buff, which takes a ton of value from this ability altogether. I can see this maybe being good for Resto or Boomy because of the haste, but I don't think that it compares to the other Soulbinds currently. Last up, we have Kyrian, who also has not received very many impactful changes. However, this is probably due to the fact that Wild Hunt Tactics is already decently strong on its own. Wild Hunt Tactics did receive a small increase to its movement speed enhancement effects, going from 10% to 15%. The only other notable change that happened to Kyrian was a change to First Strike, which gives damaging an enemy before they damage you increases your critical strike by 25%, up from 20% for 5 seconds, which is down from 10 seconds. I think the duration decrease is actually a nerf to the ability more than the extra 5% crit is a buff. However, when selecting the potency conduits in Kyrian's path, you would not select this ability anyways. That is all of the changes that are noticeable coming from the Nightfae. This includes the conflux of the element conduit we mentioned earlier. And currently, if going Nightfae, Naya will be the go-to, and Taste for Blood and Carnivorous Instincts as our potency conduits. The next video in the series went over the Necrolords of Maldraxxus, so let's see what changes have come to them since the video was made. The Necrolord ability we gain is Adaptive Swarm, which has received several base increases to the damage that it does, as well as the amount of healing that it can put out when it is on a friendly target. However, this ability still has the same issue it did before, and that is not having any AoE potential and still not being worth using while doing AoE in dungeons. The increase to the periodic effects also still has the same issue in that our bleeds are not the strongest damaging abilities in our single target fight. If this ability was able to spread to multiple targets when we have Primal Wrath on an AoE pack, then it might have some value, but in its current form, it is just not as strong as the other abilities. When it comes to the Soulbinds, however, there are several abilities that are valued when it comes to PvP specifically. So let's jump into the Necrolord Soulbinds, and first up is Plague Deviser Merilith, which, if you remember from my deep dive video, his very first ability was his strongest ability by far, which the developers agreed, and this is one of the few Soulbinds where their first ability stayed in the same spot instead of being flipped like the others. Volatile Solvent, using Fleshcraft with nearby corpses, consumes their essence completely, granting a benefit based on the creature's type. The notable effect granted by this was the mastery you could obtain from using Fleshcraft over a humanoid. This effect has been drastically reduced, going from 342 mastery to 120 mastery, as well as going from 6-minute buff to a 2-minute buff. This is no longer the hard carry that Necrolord Covenant needed to be considered, and in my deep dive video for this Covenant, I mentioned that all they would have to do is tune or adjust this ability for Feral Druids to never really consider this Covenant, and that is exactly what they did. This ability already had low value in raids with its buffed iteration, and now has a much lower value in dungeons because of its decreased effect. Next up from the Divisor, we have Ultimate Form, which is a very strong ability when it comes to content like PvP. Ultimate Form, when channeling Fleshcraft, you are immune to crowd control, and you regenerate 2% health every 1 second if you finish the full channel. You gain 4 seconds of crowd control immunity, during which you regenerate 2% health every 1 second. This was a buffed effect from when we last spoke about it, adding health regeneration along with the CC immunity, which is obvious to see the appeal when it comes to the PvP environment. The next soulbind is Emini, whose main ability was not only moved to the top of the tree, but redesigned and renamed. It is now Lead by Example instead of Embody the Construct. Lead by Example gives Adaptive Swarm increases your agility by 5% and nearby allies' primary stats by 2% for 4 seconds. You gain 5% additional agility for each ally affected up to 15%. This is a massive improvement over the AoE damage that you originally gained from the previous iteration of this ability. Primary stats are very strong in Shadowlands, and Adaptive Swarm is on a very low cooldown, giving this some value if you make sure to use Adaptive Swarm on cooldown and try to optimize the uptime of the Agility amp. There really isn't much else that Emini has to offer, however, making this one ability carry him as a soulbind, and I don't think it is doing enough. The last soulbind for the Necrolords is Hyjal, and the only notable changes to him are actually competing abilities because you can only select one or the other. First up is Hyjal's arsenal of Marrowed Gemstones. After landing 10 critical strikes, you gain 18% increased chance to critical strike for 10 seconds, may only occur once per 60 seconds. This was decreased from 20% crit for 20 seconds. This has lost a decent amount of value. In its current form, the other abilities in this one will most likely be what we take because we want the 2 potency conduits, and that is Hyjal's Arsenal Gore Stompers, which had its movement speed increased from 25% to 35%. Not a massive change, but if we look at this soulbind, this would be the route we would take for the potency conduits. All in all, my opinion of the Necrolords has not changed at all. I think the ability needs a ton of work or redesign, and now none of the soulbinds show a massive amount of promise in my opinion. And I'm kind of glad because I don't really like the Covenant leather armor either. It's just really not my style. Now let's take a look at the third Covenant in my deep dive series, and that is the Venthyr. Looking at the Venthyr ability that we obtain, we have received several changes, but most of those changes have been reverted, and now Ravenous Frenzy is as follows. For 20 seconds, Druid spells you cast increase your damage and healing by 2% and haste by 1%. If you spend 2 seconds idle, the Frenzy will overcome you, consuming 1% of your health per stack, stunning you for 1 second and ending. So even with its current iteration, you can see very small adjustments from what it was inside the deep dive video. First, it was increased back to 20 seconds, which is great because using this ability with only 15 seconds and it not linking up to the full duration of Berserk felt odd and bad to play with as a long 3-minute cooldown. Next up, they changed the haste from 2% to only giving 1% now. I don't think this was the most impactful stat given for Feral Druids, but energy regeneration is affected by this slightly, but not a massive loss in my opinion, especially since I would recommend Moment of Clarity and Cat Eye Curio when using Ravenous Frenzy because it will allow you to use this ability uninterrupted for the most part. The last part, which is the Kiss Curse that they attach to the ability, has been increased by 0.5 seconds, going from 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds. I think that they should just remove this aspect of the ability because it is not at all that interesting and only feels like it punishes the ability instead of giving more of a buff if you don't pull energy while using this ability. Also, if we look at the conduit that enhances this ability, we just got it gutted because it only gives 0.5% crit per stack. This ability only really offers the damage stacking effect for Feral Druids. And I don't think that it is as strong as several make it out to be in practice, because you are getting most of the damage from Berserk capabilities, and this is enhancing that damage. It is still a strong enhancement, it just seems like most people mistake what is actually doing the damage during this burst window. Now, let's get into the changes Venthyr soulbinds have received. The Venthyr soulbinds have all been decently strong throughout all of the Shadowlands testing and still remain decent in the current build. First up, we have Nadja, who has a few abilities that are notable, such as exacting preparations. The benefits of well-fed flasks and weapon enchantment effects are increased by 20%, up from 15%. Small gain, but still a buff, and the next ability is Dauntless Duelist, which is an ability that you would have to sacrifice a potency conduit for, and now has been decreased to increase damage by 3%, down from 4%, and reduce damage by 1.5%, down from 2%. Most still won't take this ability because you want to take the potencies, and even less because of the slight nerfs to it now. Next soulbind is going to be Theotar, which in our deep dive video about the Venthyr, we stated was going to be the go-to for Fertile Druids because of what he has to offer, and that has not changed in this build either. They switched Soothing Shade to be the main ability that Theotar gives, which is a recommendation we gave in our previous video, because in the previous build, we would have not selected the potency conduits to have this ability. This ability has also received an increase to the mastery, where your spells and abilities have a chance to call Tubbins and Gubbins to your side for 12 seconds. Parcel in hand, standing in the shaded area grants you 525 mastery. This mastery amp comes out to about 30% mastery, which is very strong. However, when testing, this proc that brings Tubbins and Gubbins to your side takes a massive amount of time, decreasing the value of the mastery by a lot because it only lasts for 12 seconds. The other drawback is that Tubbins and Gubbins do not move, so you will have to hope to proc when you can stand still and gain their benefit. Still a good change now that we have this ability as the first pick. Wasteland Propriety, which was the main ability of Theotar, is still an ability we can get. However, it has been reduced, and now Ravenous Frenzy signals the start of tea time, granting 6% versatility, down from 10% to you, and 3% versatility, down from 4% to up to 4 nearby allies, lasting 30 seconds. Even at its reduced state, this is still a decent ability that will add damage to your burst window as well as some damage to the party. The last ability Theotar has that is worth mentioning is Refined Palate, which is the effects of combat potions last 100 to 200% longer. This was increased from 20% to 100%, and the potions in Shadowlands are still decently strong, and this gives them all a longer duration. The last soulbind is General Draven, who has not seen very many changes to his abilities, and the only notable ones are Hold Your Ground's effects were increased by 2 seconds when you start moving, and Build for War was nerfed, only stacking up to 4 instead of 5. For Fertile Druids, I still think that Theotar will end up being our main soulbind from this covenant because of the Mastery Amp and the increased damage to our Ravenous Frenzy burst window. The last video in my deep dive series was the Kyrian. So let's take a look at what has changed since that video. The Kyrian give us an ability called Kindred Spirits, which has had several iterations and recently had its capabilities reduced from 25% to 20%. When I went over this ability, I stated that it might be most effective to just place this effect on yourself for the 15% damage increase that you can optimize, and with the recent reduction, this further makes me believe that this would be the way to go. Most people still mix up the 20% of damage that you exchange with another damage dealer as 20% increased in damage, and it's not. The 20% is only 20% of all the damage that individual does in those 10 seconds added to your damage as additional damage, and same goes for the damage they receive from you is 20% of the damage you do while you activate the ability is duplicated and given to the damage dealer you are linked with. However, the 15% damage increase if you place it on yourself is a straight damage increase to your abilities, and if you use it with your cooldowns can add some damage overall because Kindred Spirits is a 1-minute cooldown. In the deep dive video, the main use of Kindred Spirits was to proc combat meditation from Pelagos. Let's go ahead and dive into the soulbind changes. So Pelagos' first ability is now combat meditation. which has been reduced massively in its current iteration. In the Kyrian deep dive video, we definitely spoke about this ability being way too strong and that it was most certain that it was going to be changed, and it has. So the new combat meditation reads, Kindred Spirits increases your mastery by 233 for 10 seconds and occasionally expels sorrowful memories. Walking through sorrowful memories extends this effect by 3 seconds. So the mastery before was 720 on the tooltip, but the buff gave 1080. And now it is 233 on the tooltip, but the buff gives 350. This is obviously a massive reduction. And now the buff only gives about 20% mastery from the over 50% mastery it was giving in its previous iteration. 20% mastery is still a decent amount to gain from this ability. However, the other strong effect from its previous iteration is that you could keep this buff up 100% of the time, and that is no longer the case. Previously, 2 sorrowful memories would spawn about every 2 seconds, giving you a 6-second added to the uptime. This has changed massively, and now only 1 sorrowful memory spawns, giving 3 seconds, and you only get about 3 memories over the entire uptime of combat meditation, meaning that you will not be able to keep this ability up 100% of the time anymore. And instead, it will be around 20 seconds of uptime every minute. This change definitely makes this ability less powerful, but more in line with some of the other soulbinds and abilities. 20% mastery for 20 seconds every minute is still decently strong with a decent uptime. The other notable ability Pelagos has is Let Go of the Past. Using a spell or ability increases your versatility by 1% for 4 seconds. Using another spell or ability increases this amount by 1% when it is not a repeat of the previous spell or ability, stacking to 4%. This was reduced from 5% to 4%, and the amount of time you have to press another ability to stack up this effect was massively reduced, making players have to pressing alternating abilities rather consistently in order to keep up the 4% buff. Pelagos remains to still be very strong soulbind, even with the decent nerfs he has received. Next we have Clea, which is still very much a healing soulbind, and there is little to be gained from her for Feral Druids. However, we will mention the adjustments to Valiant Strikes, which is you and your nearby allies' critical strikes grant you a stack of Valiant Strikes up to 40. If a nearby ally drops below 50% health, you consume these stacks to heal them for 1% of their maximum health per stack. This is very strong for healers in Raid because now the group will generate 40% heals that will automatically proc on people that are below 50% HP. This still needed testing, however, during the making of this video, they released a blue post that showed that they changed it from the allies next to you to actually the party members. So now it actually is only the 4 people that can contribute to the crits, as well as contribute to getting healed from your ability. So this has been drastically changed very recently, and it still seems like it might be strong, especially if you put healers in the group with tanks, and as long as there's some crit going on. Or you can put them inside a group with melee, and melees typically do crit quite a bit. So if a paladin healer has this and they're inside the melee group, they have the chance of making sure they keep up the melee group. Anytime somebody drops below 50%, it'll give them a 40% heal. So that might be a thing inside raids. Next up, we have Mechanicos, who hasn't been blessed with very many changes at all. One to mention is that Soul Still Clamps, increasing the reduction of stuns and incapacitating durations by 30%, up from 20%. So for the Kyrian, Pelagos is still the go-to by a mile, and still decently strong even after the massive reduction to his abilities. Alright, we have made it through all the changes that have occurred since I made the deep dive video series. I know that most, including myself, were hoping for more changes before Shadowlands went live for the Feral Druid, but it looks like that is more than likely slim at best, especially since they are set on giving us overall damage increases instead of fixes to certain abilities. I hope it is in the cards for them to add some utilities to the class for raid comps so that we will be chosen to participate more often. Also, the reason I believe that we are not receiving very many damage adjustments other than just the flat damage enhancement is because as I tested out Feral, it seems that several classes are aimed around a certain damage number, and Feral is sitting somewhere around that damage number. You know, probably a little bit lower than some, and that's why we're getting those damage modifiers. However, we're basically around the same grouping as those other damage dealers, at least in practice. And if Blizzard's aiming to have everybody somewhere around this number, then Feral Druid's not going to get very many big changes to their class if we can reach that number currently. So there are still a few outliers to this, which would be the Frost Mage and the MM Hunter, who have just recently seen some changes, so we'll have to see if that actually did affect them enough to bring them down off their pedestal of reigning champion. However, it is more likely that these classes will be brought in line, meaning brought down, rather than other classes being brought up. So if Feral is in a damage range that Blizzard is aiming for, then they are more than likely not going to receive many more buffs or changes until raid testing is released or more numbers are in. With that being said, let me know what you think about the changes, and let me know what Covenant and Soulbind you are leaning towards taking in the Shadowlands. If you love the Feral spec as much as I do, I would say hang in there, and there is a chance that we will do decent in this expansion. Maybe not right at the start, but we are in a much better state than we were at the start of BFA, and it will hopefully only get better. If you like this video and the content that I am creating, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to get content updates or just chat, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/sageshifter, as well as on Twitter and Instagram at sageshifter. The next video I am working on is the response video for the community questions, so if you have any more questions, please watch that video or just leave them in the comments below on this one. As always, thank you all for the support, and I will see you again next time.